You're going to learn this from the very first second, how a young queen named Margaret of Burgundy, daughter-in-law of the most feared king in Europe, was accused of turning the French court into a brothel. How a tiny clue, 2 embroidered pouches, became dynamite that set off arrests, torture and executions. How the so-called Tower of Nesle turned into a byword for infamy. How Margaret Guest's fall in the year 1314 and her death in 1315 opened a dynastic rift that step by step helped lead France and England into the 100 Years' War. I will tell you the crime, the trial, the propaganda machine, and the political legacy. That is what you're about to hear, the anatomy of a scandal where a bed disturbed a throne. Breathe. Before the Tower, there is a kingdom. France at the dawn of the 14th century is a cold, precise machine tuned by Philip IV, nicknamed the Fair, tall, impenetrable, surrounded by jurists who turned law into a sword. Under his reign, the Templars have been dismantled and their wealth absorbed. The papacy has been pushed to Avignon. Lombard bankers have learned what it means to challenge a monarch who thinks in numbers and precedents rather than outbursts. At his side grow his 3 sons, Louis, Philip and Charles, and his daughter Isabella, married to England's king. That is the stage, a throne that seems unassailable and a family watched by visible and invisible eyes. Margaret of Burgundy enters that scene as a piece in a massive chessboard. Born around 1285, daughter of Duke Robert of Burgundy, her fate is sealed in childhood. She will be political currency, a bridge between houses, a guarantee of alliances. Marriage to Louis, Philip's firstborn, places her at the top of the world, and at the center of a gilded cage. Her husband, sour and impatient, is not an easy prince. Her father-in-law, Philip, turns palace intimacy into a matter of state. In a world where the dynasty is perpetuated in wombs that do not belong to themselves, the faintest whisper about a princess's behavior can unleash storms. The spark takes the form of a gift. Isabella of France, the same who history will nickname the she-wolf of France for other reasons, returns from England with presents for her sisters-in-law. Small embroidered pouches, delicate, meant to hold perfume or coins. Weeks later she sees those very pouches hanging from the belts of 2 Norman knights, the brothers Philip and Gautier d'Aulnay. The scene is tiny, but the world it opens is abyssal. Isabella understands the social code. Those embroideries do not belong where they are. Suspicion becomes an arrow. She informs her father. And the machinery of a state expert in turning clues into verdicts whirs to life. Surveillance tightens. The king's messengers trace steps. Profile servants memorize guards. Reports appear of meetings at improper hours, of boats nosing up to a dark landing, of a rope ladder uncoiling near a tower by the Seine. The tower has a name, Nesle. Between its stones, rumour says, there were toasts, laughter, and kisses where they did not belong. The names that surface are 3, Margaret, wife of Louis, Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles, and Joan of Burgundy, wife of Philip. What malicious chroniclers call orgy, the king's jurists call dynastic treason. In April 1314, the d'Aulnay brothers are seized. The narrative changes tense, from suspicion to confession, from rumour to sentence. Medieval justice, when it turns theatrical, does not seek truth, it seeks utility. The d'Aulnays are tortured. Under wheel, iron and fire, their bodies say what the judges want to hear. Yes, there was adultery. Yes, the Tower of Nesle was more than stone. Yes, the princesses gave themselves to a pleasure that stains bloodlines. The punishment is choreography, castration, flaying, beheading, and hanging before crowds who learn the lesson without need of grammar. The court exhales. The message has been sent. The danger, they think, has been contained. The women will not face that public spectacle. Their judgments move along palace channels. Joan, wife of Philip, will find powerful defenders and emerge with life and title, shadowed but crowned. Blanche will be confined and later repudiated. Margaret draws the longest thorn. She is declared guilty, her hair is shorn, she is chained, sent first to Gisors, and then to Château Gaillard, that fortress Richard the Lionheart raised like an eagle's nest over a bend in the Seine. There, damp is law, and winter the executioner. There, a queen becomes a prisoner. Here, it's worth pushing aside the smoke of myth. Did Margaret turn the court into a brothel? No serious document sustains an organized palace-run ring of prostitution. There may have been, clandestine encounters. There was, certainly, an exploitation of scandal by power. But what looked like a sexual offense was, for the monarchy, a political risk. Doubt about the legitimacy of heirs. If the wife of the heir sleeps with another man whose child will be born with the right to France, that question is dynamite. And the power's answer, then, becomes pitiless. Meanwhile, the old king falls. Philip the Fair dies in November of that same year during a hunt. The crown passes to Louis, Margaret's husband. The new king has an immediate problem. He needs heirs without blemish. He could keep his wife locked up and live with the humiliation, or he could rid himself of her by law, by sickness, by accident, and marry again. He chooses the latter. In August 1315, Margaret dies at Château Gaillard. The official version speaks of illness. The whispers speak of hands and pillows. History, as so often, writes the word timely. Louis the Kix, now widowed, marries Clementia of Hungary. From that marriage will come first a daughter, and after the king's death, a posthumous son, John the Posthumous, born and dead within days in 1316. With him, the direct Capetian line goes out. Enter the dead man's brothers, Philip V and Charles IV. Two short reigns, two enormous problems. The lack of male heirs. And here the strands of the Tower of Nesle case tie with a rope that spans centuries. The question whether a woman can inherit the throne, the question that across the Channel will feed Isabella of France's claims for her son Edward, receives in Paris a blunt answer: no. Jurists will invoke the law of the Franks as custom. Later it will be called Salic Law. Excluding the female line props up the rise of the Valois and plants the seed of a gigantic conflict with the English crown. The rumour about a tower ends, with time, in a 100-year war. Let us glance back at Isabella, messenger of the spark. Daughter of Philip IV, trained to sniff out threats, married to Edward II of England, a king more devoted to his favourite than to sovereignty. Isabella learns early that survival in the royal cage depends not only on blood, but on calculation. Her report about the embroidered pouches was not caprice. It was a tactical act defending her house's prestige. Years later, she will cross the Channel to overthrow her own husband. The echo of Nesle resounds in her biography as training, learning to use rumour, alliance, and staging. The Daunet brothers remain as tragic shades, knights who perhaps loved, perhaps were used, and who, in any case, were sacrificed to carve a moral in stone. The punitive apparatus sought more than to punish two men. It sought to rewrite the body of the court as a sacred space guarded by the King's law. That Paris watched the execution was part of the rite. That the princesses disappeared into wet cells was part of it too. And Margaret, what face lay behind the stigma? Do not think of her only as an emblem. Picture the young woman crossing borders to marry a man she did not choose, learning alien protocols as if they were masses, waking each day under the eyes of ladies, pages, confessors, and spies. In that bioscope of control, loneliness leads to errors or to armor. If she met someone in a tower, she did so in a world without refugees or windows of her own. If she did not, she paid for a political theatre that needed a scapegoat. Château Gaillard, perched like a hawk over the Seine, is more than a stage. It is symbol. Built by an English king as a challenge to the Capetians, it now cages a Capetian queen as penance. Its walls of lime and water condense centuries of contest between France and England, of architecture turned into message. Their queens die, and silences are written. That Margaret exhales her last breath, there adds to her myth the outline of a closed circle. From alliance to rupture, from luxury to cold, from court to hollow. There is in this story a lesson about the relation between sexuality and state. In medieval monarchies, queens' beds were legal laboratories, not out of prudery, though morality was invoked, but because of the urgency of succession. A consort's body was not private. It was a site of dynastic verification. Therefore, the punishment of Margaret was exemplary. Therefore, Joan was exonerated with care, because her husband, the future Philip V, needed intact legitimacy. Therefore, Blanche was confined and annulled, a contest of expiations to soothe a kingdom's anxiety that cradles might be coffers of deceit. The expression brothel, which centuries later will adorn pamphlets and novels, does not describe a fact. It describes an intent to degrade symbolically the court space to exalt the king's correcting hand. Scandal produces obedience because it humiliates the nobility, trims imprudence, strengthens surveillance, and legitimizes the sovereign's intervention in his own house's intimacy. It is an impeccable operation of power, turning rumors into rules. And even so, the cost was high. Philip V and Charles IV reigned briefly and left little. The idea that the male line must be preserved at any cost generated quick solutions, repudiations, confinement, messaging, and slow problems, succession crises, combinations of rights, English ambitions. When in 1328 the direct Capetian branch goes extinct, the decision to exclude women and their sons hardens. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through Isabella, sees Paris's doors close and, instead, those of the campaign open. The price of that night on the landing, amplified by jurists and chroniclers, appears in the death lists of fields yet to come. Let us pause on the texture of days, because rigor also lives in the concrete. Medieval courts were buzzing honeycombs of eye and ear, servants going in and out of bedchambers, ladies who dress and undress, chaplains who listen and comment, porters who count hours of return. The Tower of Nesle was not in a desert. It formed part of the river's defensive perimeter near the Tuileries of the time, in a Paris that had not yet dreamed of its modern Louvre. A boat at night was not invisible. It was a risk someone had to tolerate. That is why the clue of the embroidered pouches weighed, because it made visible what many imagined without proof. The trial of the Dornays was designed to be remembered. They were not only stripped of their knightly condition, they were turned into a warning all bodies understand: pain, shame, and death. The justice of Philip the Fair always sought that mixture of classicism and cruelty, solemnity of form, brutality of substance. Law was not shelter, it was hammer. In that sense, the Tower of Nesle was a second fall of the Templars, evidence that the king could turn intimate enemies, warrior monks or lovers, into pedagogical rubble. And yet history's smile is bitter. Severity did not save the dynasty. The kings who followed watched fortune fray in their hands. The people, who had attended executions like catechism, would slowly face famines, plagues, taxes sprouting like weeds. The mistrust born from controlling women's bodies turned into mutual suspicion. The court feared the city mocked the court. Poets made their harvest with tales mixing truth and malice, reputation that liquid capital had cracked. Now see Margaret once more, but in a different light. Imagine her schooling, French mastered with a Burgundian accent, genealogies committed to memory, litanies recited, submission to protocols measuring even the tilt of the neck. Imagine the distance with her harsh-tempered husband. Imagine the corridors where one ill-phrased word floats for days. Imagine the weight of knowing herself the womb of France. In that landscape, there is no space for imprudence, and yet history insists there may have been some. If there was, it was human. If there was not, the sentence was inhuman. The end, you know it, has no violins. August, damp, a cell. The river runs below as if repeating the city without learning it. A body coughs, a name loses shine. A queen ceases to be a subject and becomes an object of someone else's pen. The castle that once symbolized English daring keeps the small revenge of having also been a French cage. Silence always is power's best accomplice. And upon that silence grows the phrase that crosses centuries, the queen who turned the court into a brothel. The echo is effective because it wounds and because it simplifies, but you now know history rarely fits in a single sentence. You know that behind it there is engineering, jurists framing, counsellors whispering, queens calculating, lovers trembling, brothers falling, chroniclers rounding off, poets inventing. You know that rumour is a weapon and punishment its shot. You know that medieval French statecraft learned from this case something it would use forever, that public morality can be the mould for power's iron. That is why this tale does not end with a verdict on Margaret's heart, but with a lesson about crowns and beds. The scandal of the Tower of Nesle was less a private excess than a dress rehearsal for sovereign control. It served to purge, to discipline, to shield, to tie off laws that decades later would block an English line's entry to the throne and ignite wars spanning generations. It also served to remind us that great maps are sometimes drawn with ink of small tears. If you've listened this far, you take away more than a spicy medieval tale. You carry the radiograph of a dynasty at the edge of extinction, the choreography of a justice that thinks in audiences, the biography of a queen-turned instrument, the prologue to a war we all know by its length. Above all, you carry a useful suspicion. When palace judges look at the bed, they are really staring at the throne. Share this story and subscribe to Kings of History. There are many towers, many beds, and many maps still to read. Because history, when you hear it like this, is not past, it's a mirror. And sometimes the mirror returns a tower over a river, a cord that tightens, and a crown that weighs more than guilt.